It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in downtown Brooklyn, the streets alive with the hum of everyday life. Maya Tyson, 19, had just finished spending the afternoon with her friends, her curly brown hair bouncing with each step as she walked home. Little did she know, her peaceful day was about to be shattered. Two racist gang members, Tyler and Vince, had been watching her from the shadows. As Maya made her way down the street, they closed the distance, their eyes locked onto her like predators closing in on their prey. One of the men, Tyler, sneered as he looked her up and down, his hate-filled gaze seething with malice. He nudged Vince, muttering under his breath, "She's one of them." Without warning, Tyler flipped open his lighter. The flame sparked to life, and in a swift, cruel motion he held it to Maya's hair, setting it ablaze. Unaware that the young woman they were tormenting was the daughter of one of the most dangerous men in the world, they would soon learn just how deadly a mistake they had made. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon in downtown Brooklyn, and Maya Tyson, 19, had just wrapped up a coffee date with her friends. As she stepped out of the cafe, the warm sunlight kissed her curly brown hair, making it bounce with each confident step she took. She adjusted her purse, a picture of grace and ease, completely unaware of the danger closing in. Maya wasn't just any young woman. She had inherited more than her father's sharp determination. She embodied his unshakable spirit, his raw confidence, and his fierce belief in standing up for herself no matter the odds. As she walked, humming a carefree tune, she was oblivious to the two men watching her with predatory eyes. Tyler and Vince, two racist gang members, had their sights set on her like hungry vultures circling their prey. Their eyes followed her every move, and their sinister grin spread across their faces as they stood by their parked motorcycle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Maya had no idea what was coming, until it was too late. Tyler and Vince weren't just two random men. They were members of a gang that thrived on hate. They had made it their twisted mission to terrorize anyone who didn't look like them, anyone they could impose their cruelty on without consequence. And today, Maya Tyson was their target. "She's one of them," Vince muttered under his breath, nudging Tyler, his voice dripping with venom and malice. His words were barely a whisper, but they were charged with contempt, a silent threat hanging in the air. Tyler's lips twisted into a leprous grin, a smirk that stretched unnaturally as he looked Maya up and down. His eyes gleamed with malicious intent, like a predator about to strike. Without a word, he flicked open his lighter, the sharp snap of the mechanism echoing through the stillness of the street. A cold thrill ran through his veins. "Let's give her a real reason to run," he hissed, the words sliding from his lips like poison. His gaze flickered to the parked motorcycle nearby, his mind working, planning, scheming. With every passing second, the tension grew, thickening the air around them. They had no idea who they were messing with. Maya was about to find herself in a fight she never saw coming, one that would change everything. The tension in the air grew thick, like a storm waiting to break. Maya stood at the crosswalk, unaware of the danger creeping ever closer. Her heart pounded in sync with the flickering walk signal, the rhythm of her pulse quickening, unknowingly preparing her for the chaos that was about to explode in her life. Behind her, Vince moved like a shadow, his footsteps nearly silent, yet saturated with a malevolent energy that seemed to press on her very soul. Every step he took was deliberate, each one bringing him closer to his prey. Meanwhile, Tyler was closer than she could imagine, a twisted grin on his face as his lighter sparked to life. The flame, small but deadly, flickered and danced with sickening delight, like a firefly born from hatred, its light cutting through the air with a malignancy all its own. The heat from the lighter seemed to reach out toward her, an unholy extension of Tyler's cruel intentions. Then, in the blink of an eye, it happened. The delicate strands of Maya's hair, the very crown of her youth and beauty, were suddenly caught by the fire, consumed by the flickering, sickly flame. The searing pain hit her like a punch to the gut, the smell of burning hair a sharp, nauseating reminder of the world she was now trapped in. Tyler's lighter, an instrument of hatred, had transformed into a torch, one that would burn her in more ways than just the physical. The flames scorched through Maya's hair, a hateful fire that cut through the innocence of the moment like a blade through silk. What had once been a carefree afternoon, full of light and life, was suddenly consumed by the cruel, burning touch of bigotry. The world around her shifted in an instant, and in that blink of an eye, Maya was ripped from her peaceful reverie and thrown into a nightmare. The heat of the flame engulfed her, a suffocating pressure that pushed her into a world of agony and terror. Her sense of safety, the simple assurance of a normal day, was lacerated in an instant, like a hot knife slashing through her skin. Fear, sharp and raw, washed over her in waves, drowning out everything she had known. Then, the air, once warm and comforting, was shattered by screams, cries of panic that rang out with the chilling resonance of violence. The sound tore through the afternoon, signaling the start of something far worse than she could have imagined. Maya spun around, her body moving on instinct, a deer caught in headlights. Her glossy eyes, wide with shock, ballooned with terror as she locked eyes with the horrific sight. The flames eating away at her hair, the pain searing through her scalp like a fiery brand. The flames, hungry and unrelenting, devoured Maya's hair with the ferocity of a wild beast, twisting and writhing as they grew larger. The sight of the fire, licking at her curls like a ravenous predator, sent a wave of panic crashing through her chest. But even in the midst of the horror, something remarkable began to stir in the crowd, a primal sense of justice that could not stand idly by. The bystanders, who had once been frozen in shock, now surged forward with an urgent, almost desperate determination. Their eyes burned with compassion, a collective resolve that drove them to act. One man, his face a blur of horror and empathy, didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he threw his jacket over Maya's head, his hands shaking with both fear and the need to protect. The fabric fell over her like a shield, smothering the flames that had once danced with hellish glee. The fire, its cruel joy extinguished by the weight of the jacket, flickered and died in an instant. What had once been a tormenting inferno was now nothing more than a cloud of smoke and the acrid smell of burned hair. The crowd, breathless and shaken, watched as the last of the flames vanished, leaving Maya trembling in the aftershock of her close encounter with death. In the blink of an eye, the jacket, now heavy with the weight of its sacrifice, had extinguished the flames. But the chaos it had smothered could not simply disappear. The air was thick with the mournful smoke that lingered, curling in the air like the remnants of a nightmare. A bitter stench of singed hair hung in the atmosphere, a constant reminder of the cruelty that had just unfolded. The damage, like the mark of a demonic force, was permanently etched into the scorched remains of Maya's hair. Each singed strand was a painful echo of the horror that had just been unleashed upon her, a cruel imprint of hatred that would never fully fade. Her once rich, flowing curls, a symbol of her beauty and youth, were now reduced to a frayed, smoldering wreck. What had been a crown of confidence and joy was now a testament to the violence of the world, its once stunning coils now a ragged, burned reminder of human cruelty. The gang members, their mockery still hanging in the air, reveled in the destruction they had caused. But their laughter, once filled with malicious triumph, now felt hollow, as if they too could sense the heavy weight of the consequences they had yet to face. The emptiness inside Tyler and Vince was laid bare for all to see, their malicious laughter echoing through the street like the cawing of vultures. Their mocking cackles cut through the air, a celebration of cruelty that tainted everything around them. They reveled in the pain they had inflicted, their joy as twisted as it was undeserved. "Guess she won't be showing off that hair anymore," Tyler sneered, his voice thick with venom and empty ridicule. His words dripped with a toxic sense of superiority, as if tormenting another human being was a pastime without consequence, a cheap thrill to feed his sick soul. Vince, with a grin so cold it could freeze the very air around him, added his own putrid contribution to the scene. "Yeah, maybe next time she'll stay where she belongs," he spat, his voice laced with hatred. His words, as filthy as his smile, were a vile proclamation of everything he stood for. It was a message of subjugation, a cruel reminder of the world they thought they could control. The venom in Vince's eyes was pure hatred, his glare as vicious as that of a rabid dog, feral and uncontrollable. He radiated contempt, a dangerous force that knew nothing but the poison of racism. His eyes were a reflection of a mind warped by bitterness, ready to lash out at anyone who dared defy the narrow, ugly worldview he had trapped himself in. The bystanders, once mere observers, were now bound together by a shared collective horror. Their souls were gripped by the appalling display of cruelty they had just witnessed, the weight of racism heavy on the air. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a stunned silence. The vibrant pulse of the city, once alive with energy and chatter, now lay still, its life force drained by the agony unfolding before them. The street had become a grim, silent witness to the suffering of a young woman, a motherless child whose spirit had just been assaulted by the poisonous sins of society. The silence that followed was deafening, wrapping the scene in a suffocating cloak of despair. It was as if the world itself had paused, unwilling to acknowledge the darkness that had overtaken the moment. All that was left in the aftermath was the heavy weight of grief and the hum of rage that buzzed beneath the surface, threatening to break free at any moment. And then, in the midst of the suffocating silence, a single voice shattered the stillness. It emerged like a flag of defiance, a banner of courage and unwavering conviction cutting through the heavy air. The words struck with the force of a whip, cracking like thunder, electrifying the atmosphere with its raw, commanding authority. This voice, deep and powerful, held a clarity that rang through the streets, reverberating off the buildings and into the hearts of every stunned bystander. "Who did this?" it roared, its intensity like a divine summons, a cry that transcended the limitations of mere mortals. It wasn't just a question. It was a call to justice, a summons that demanded an answer, a reckoning. The crowd, frozen until that moment, snapped into motion. A surge of energy swept through them as they instinctively scattered to the sides of the street, making way for the source of the voice. Fear mingled with awe, and for the first time since the attack, the crowd felt a glimmer of hope. The crowd's movements became a dance of reverence, a choreography of awe and respect. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on them as they instinctively parted, creating a path down the street. And in the center of this sea of mortals, a figure stepped forward, his presence more imposing than a tsunami, more powerful than the force of nature itself. There he was, Mike Tyson, the legend. His eyes burned like twin volcanoes, molten with a fury that seemed ready to erupt. His jaw was squared, set in a grim, diamond-hard jut of determination, a man who had seen the depths of the world and emerged unbroken. Every muscle in his body, honed to perfection, radiated power and athleticism. The legendary boxer, the former heavyweight champion of the world, stood there like a living statue of rage and resolve. He was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, possessed by a divine fury that demanded attention, respect, and justice. Carved from indomitable will and pure fury, Mike Tyson stood in the middle of the street like a living monument. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, gripped by the overwhelming force of his emotions, an emotional tsunami that threatened to break free at any moment. His jaw was set, tighter than the walls of a fortified bunker, as solid and unyielding as the will of steel itself. Maya, her beauty now overshadowed by the burns and scars that marred her hair, turned to face the figure of her father. In that moment, all the pain and fear she had endured seemed to be swallowed by the sheer power of his presence. Her tears glistened like blood diamonds, heavy with both relief and agony, falling from her eyes as if they could pierce the heavens themselves. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a broken symphony, a delicate mix of relief and raw grief, as if those two simple words could somehow heal the wounds that had been inflicted on her. But the pain was too deep, the scars too fresh. Yet in that moment, With her father standing before her, she knew that nothing, no amount of pain, could break the unyielding bond between them. Mike Tyson did not flinch. He did not blink. He did not breathe. His gaze, cold and unyielding, shifted from his daughter, whose tear-filled eyes now sought solace, to the men who had dared to hurt her. His eyes locked onto Tyler and Vince, the fire within them a raptor's glare of predatory justice. It was a look that promised retribution, a stare so fierce that it seemed to strip the very air of its warmth. Tyler and Vince, once full of arrogance and malice, now found themselves paralyzed. Their faces, once flushed with the thrill of their cruel actions, drained of all color, turning ashen with fear. The realization of the wrath they had just unleashed hit them like a tidal wave, and in that instant their swagger evaporated. They were no longer the hunters. They were prey. The glacial gale of Mike Tyson's glare froze them in their tracks, their legs turning to stone beneath the weight of their terror. A cold chill swept through their bodies as they stood there, rooted to the ground, unable to escape the undeniable power that radiated from him. In that moment, they realized the magnitude of their mistake, the fear of what was coming for them now sinking in with suffocating clarity. Tyler and Vince, once consumed by their arrogance and ignorance, had no idea who Maya truly was. But they were about to learn, in the most brutal way possible. They were oblivious to the fact that Maya Tyson was not just any girl. She was the daughter of Mike Tyson, a man who had ruled the ring with unmatched dominance. His reputation was as lethal as a rhino's charge, as brutal and unforgiving as a blow that could shatter bone. Tyler and Vince had made a fatal mistake, and now they would pay the price. Mike Tyson's voice, low and controlled, coiled with a power that seemed to crackle through the air. When he spoke, it was like a thunderclap, his words falling with the weight of justice, cutting through the tension like axes. Each syllable struck with the force of a reprimand, as if his words alone were enough to lay bare the consequences of their actions. Tyler and Vince, once so smug and certain of their superiority, now found themselves trembling under the crushing weight of his presence. Their faces, once flushed with malice, now wore the pale, sickly hue of fear. The reality of their mistake was hitting them hard, and there was no escape from what was coming next. Tyler and Vince stood frozen, their dread growing with every passing second, the weight of their impending doom settling on them like a heavy fog. "Yo, we were just messing around, old man," Tyler stammered, his bravado crumbling as his words faltered into a pitiful attempt at deflection. His once confident resolve shattered, revealing the true nature of his panic, his lies spilling from his lips like shameful filth, a pathetic attempt to mask his fear. But Mike Tyson was not impressed. His gaze remained as stoic and unyielding as a stone gargoyle, unshaken by the feeble words that clung to the air. His jaw was set, a grimace of stern determination twisting his face. It was the look of a man who had long mastered the art of restraint, his fury now a coiled spring waiting to be unleashed. Mike Tyson, the enigma of controlled rage, did not flinch. He did not blink. He did not breathe as he moved with the fluidity and speed of a cobra. His fists, each strike as precise and deadly as a venomous strike, cut through the air like the inevitable punishment of fate itself. Like cobalt lightning, Mike Tyson, a juggernaut of unleashed fury, swept through the space between him and his attackers, his movement a blur of raw power and righteous wrath. The king of boxing, a force of nature in his own right, erupted like a volcano. His body, blazing with the heat of revenge, seemed to radiate an unstoppable energy, and his fists came down with the devastation of a tornado. Boom! The first punch landed, swift and merciless, like a roulette wheel spinning with the force of a thunderclap. It struck Tyler's gut with the impact of a freight train, the power of it launching him backward, as if propelled by the force of a bombshell. Tyler's body slammed into a parked car with a sickening, bone-crushing thud that reverberated through the streets, the sound echoing like the death knell of his arrogance. It was a sound that told the entire block, This was no longer a fight. This was judgment. Before Vince could even begin to process the shock of Tyler's destruction, Mike Tyson, like a legendary warrior of old, unleashed the uppercut of damnation. His fist connected with Vince's jaw with the crushing force of a hammer striking an anvil, the impact so brutal that it lifted the gang member off the ground, his body weightless, suspended in the air like a rag doll. Vince crashed to the pavement with a sickening thud, his body going limp, inert, as if every ounce of life had been drained from him in that one catastrophic blow. The bystanders, their eyes wide with disbelief, stood frozen in a collective trance of shock. Their mouths hung agape at the raw power they had just witnessed, their minds struggling to process the sheer force of Tyson's fury. A wave of horror and awe surged through the crowd, their gasps cutting through the silence like a sudden storm, as the realization of what they had just seen took hold. It wasn't just a fight, it was an execution. And Mike Tyson was the judge, jury, and executioner all in one. A wave of surprise and apprehension crashed over the bystanders, a tsunami of shock that left them breathless and rooted to the spot. Tyler, his body battered and aching like a beaten dog, his mind reeling from the savage assault, stumbled to his feet. His balance was as fragile as a stack of cardboard boxes in a gale. Each step, a struggle, his hands flailing through the air, desperate for something to steady him. His vision blurred with the dimming haze of pain, his mind consumed by the suffocating tide of dread that swelled within him. Tyler swayed dangerously, like a sailboat caught in a hurricane, his every breath a laborious heave. His body was no longer his own. It was a thing broken and undone, moving on instinct, like a wolf creeping toward its prey, knowing it was about to meet its end. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Mike Tyson, his body radiating the very threat of fury. He was a force of nature, an immovable object, a predator who had claimed his territory, and there was no escape for the man who had dared to provoke him. Mike Tyson advanced upon Tyler, his shadow lengthening like the murderous talons of a dark predator. The air around him seemed to thicken with the promise of destruction. Each step he took a reminder that there would be no mercy. "You like playing with fire, huh?" Tyson growled, his voice low and cold, an icy grip that sank deep into Tyler's soul. His words cut through the silence of the street like a serrated knife, each syllable filled with an unforgiving power. Tyler's body trembled under the weight of it, his every instinct screaming for escape, but there was nowhere to run. In a fit of desperation, Tyler's eyes went wild with fear, his mind racing to find a way out. His body shook like a lighthouse in the midst of a storm. With a frantic motion, he reached into his jacket and drew a knife, a sliver of steel that felt like a toy in comparison to the titanic presence of Mike Tyson. It was a miscalculation, a fatal error. Like a striking viper, Mike Tyson moved with lightning speed. In an instant, he snatched Tyler's wrist out of the air, his grip tightening like a steel clamp around the gang member's trembling arm. With brutal precision, he twisted it, his strength and rage melding into one. The sound of Tyler's arm snapping, a bone-crushing crack, reverberated through the air. The sound was a primal, soul-piercing snap, a scream that tore through the stillness of the street, echoing in the hearts of everyone who heard it. It was the kind of scream that would haunt the streets for years, a cry of agony that signaled the moment of reckoning. Tyler's body collapsed under the weight of his own pain, but Mike Tyson stood above him, unyielding, like a predator with its prey caught firmly in its grip. Tyson's pupils were dilated with rage, his breath hot and heavy, steaming with the righteous vengeance that surged through him. He leaned in close, his words a whisper that sliced through the air like venom. "You don't hurt my family. Ever." Mike Tyson's voice shifted, his tone darkening into something chilling, like the rattle of a grim reaper's scythe, an ominous warning of what was to come. It was the voice of an avenger, a harbinger of death. And with a single devastating right hook, Tyson unleashed hell upon Tyler. The punch landed with a force so raw, so unrelenting, that it slammed into Tyler's face like the judgment of God itself. It wasn't just a punch, it was the very hand of fate, powerful enough to shake the earth beneath them. Boom! The sound reverberated, a thunderclap that shook the street and sent shockwaves through the air. Tyler's body was sent careening backward, crashing to the concrete like a rag doll. His form sprawled out, limbs flopping uselessly as if his very soul had been ripped from his body. He lay there, lifeless, like a marionette whose strings had been severed, betraying the absolute termination of his consciousness. His body, once a vessel of arrogance and violence, now lay broken and motionless. The sirens, wailing in the distance, grew louder as the reality of the situation sank in. But for Tyler, it was too late. His fate had already been sealed. The sound of sirens grew deafening as the NYPD arrived on the scene, their squad cars screeching to a halt like horses reined in by a blacksmith's hammer. The flashing lights of blue and red spun in a chaotic kaleidoscope, cutting through the darkened street, revealing the massive figure of Mike Tyson standing tall like a monument to justice. His stance was unyielding, a gargantuan presence that seemed to swallow the space around him. With a single deliberate motion, Tyson pointed a finger toward the culprits, the gang members who had dared to cross the line. The officer, a paragon of law and order, stepped forward, his eyes darting between the scene of destruction and the brutalized figure of Mike Tyson. "What happened here?" the officer asked, his voice heavy with the weight of uncertainty, as if he were a puzzle master staring down a problem too complex to solve. The authority in his tone was undeniable, but it was tinged with confusion. How could one man bring so much justice in an instant? Mike Tyson, standing as a judge in the court of public opinion, remained unwavering, his strength and honor undiminished by the flames of justice that had danced around him. Sweat, a reminder of the fierce vengeance he had unleashed, clung to his brow, trickling down his face like a river of punishment. "They played with fire," Tyson's voice rumbled, deep and ominous, like a lugubrious roll of thunder. "And they got burned." The finality of his words reverberated through the street like a bombardment of cannons, each syllable cutting through the air with the sharpness of a razor's edge. The emphasis of his message hung heavy in the air, as if to say, the scales of justice had been balanced, and there was no room for mercy here. The NYPD, their faces painted with the gravity of the situation, took in the scene. Their judgment would come, but in that moment, they understood the power of what had just transpired. The law might prevail, but it was clear that Mike Tyson's version of justice had already been served. The streets would remember this day. The senior cop, his expression etched with the weight of the moment, nodded in solemn understanding. The gravitas of Mike Tyson's words had lent credibility to the scene, and the officer's gaze remained as fixed and unyielding as the stare of an eagle, unblinking and resolute. He issued his order with the cool precision of a commander on the battlefield. "Take them away," he decreed, his voice sharp, like a hammer striking the anvil of justice. His words sealed the fates of the beaten gang members, the final judgment delivered without hesitation. The police swiftly moved in, cuffing the unconscious criminals with mechanical efficiency, their limp bodies like lambs to the slaughter, dragged away by the very law they had tried to defy. But no one was focused on them now. The bystanders, who had witnessed the raw power of Tyson's fury and the righteous justice that followed, could no longer contain their admiration. A wave of emotion swept through them, and they erupted into applause and cheers that rang out through the streets like the thunderous beat of a victory march. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, a collective affirmation of what had just transpired. Mike Tyson, the symbol of strength and justice, stood unmoving in the center of it all. His chest heaved with the exertion of his righteous rage, but his eyes never wavered, his presence undeniable, a living monument to the power of standing up for what was right. Maya's body still trembled, a mix of shock and rage coursing through her veins. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet her father's, her voice barely more than a fragile symphony of pain and sorrow, carrying the weight of both her physical and emotional scars. "Dad, my hair," she whispered, the devastation of her wounded locks slicing through her heart like the sting of a malicious insult. The once beautiful curls, now ravaged by the flames of cruelty, felt like an irreplaceable loss. Mike Tyson's heart swelled with a deep, fatherly protectiveness. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her in an embrace as powerful and unyielding as an iron fortress. His muscular arms formed a protective shield around her, blocking out the bitter winds of racism, the hate that had tried to break her. "It'll grow back, baby," he whispered softly, his voice thick with both reassurance and the unspoken promise of protection. "And those cowards, they'll never take your pride." His tone as soothing as a mountain stream, wrapped around her like a balm for her battered soul. But there was no mistaking the steel in his words as he continued. "But those cowards, they'll never get their pride back." "Justice," he said, his voice rising with quiet intensity, "like the stars in the night sky, shines brightest when ignited by the innate goodness of the human spirit. The threads of hatred that weave through our society may try to bind us, but they will always be met with resolve, courage, and the unwavering strength of those who stand against them." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before finishing with a promise, one that would resonate in the hearts of all who heard it. "As long as heroes like you, Maya, and like me, exist, the torch of righteousness will remain lit. We are the ones who guide the path for those who follow. So stand up, speak out, and protect the ones you love. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Have a good day."